Hi, I'm David Levine. I'm co-chair of Science Writers in New York. I want to thank Joe Bonner, who's making this possible, because a minute ago, I had my speaker on the wrong platform and it wasn't working. My guest tonight is Dr. Paul Zak. He's a professor of economics, psychology, and management at Claremont Graduate University. He is ranked in the top 0.3% of most cited scientists with over 170 published papers and more than 18,000 citations. Dr. Zak's research has made a substantial impact in explaining the variation in human social behaviors. He is a regular TED speaker. His TED Talk, titled Trust, Morality, and Oxytocin, has been viewed nearly 2 million times. He's on a lot of TV shows, and he's the country's leading pioneer in the field of neuroeconomics, which studies the neurochemical roots of human decision-making in the context of economic behavior. We're here tonight to speak about his new book, which is Immersion, the Science of the Extraordinary and the Source of Happiness. It's based on 50,000 measurements of brain activity, offers a framework readers can apply to nearly any situation to transform the ordinary to extraordinary. So Dr. Zak, welcome. Nice to see you again. So I have a question. So I'm reading your book and it talks about a movie that I saw, which I'm kind of a little embarrassed to say I enjoyed, was The Hitman's Bodyguard. Yeah. And you talk about this movie saying you could predict that it was going to be popular. What made it so popular? They actually made a sequel.
Right.
So for people who haven't seen this is a movie that stars Ryan Reynolds,
Samuel Jackson,
who's ubiquitous in movies, and I forget who else. And
the sequel has Salma Hayek, so that's of course always a draw.
Selma, yeah. I mean, it's not an intellectual movie. It's not Schindler's List, but why was it popular?
Good question. So let's go back one step and ask, for people who create creative content, which is really all of us, right? We're all creating interesting content. There's an interesting philosophical dilemma, which is many artists say, well, if I love this, it's going to be awesome. And I think there's something to that. But at some level, if we need to sell our creative content, we've got to ensure that other people love it like we do. Right? So I think there is this maybe a pure artist in the audience who just doesn't care. I'm not sure. We put a lot of effort into our creative content, right? So we really want to know. So I think the point of the book is that there are technologies now that allow us to measure other people's brains to assess whether they care about something or not. So what does care mean? So neurologically, we identified signals in the brain that I believe are a valuation mechanism for an experience with social content. So the more something is valued, the more I want to do it again, the more pleasure I get from it, the more I remember it, the more impact it has on my behavior. And so we use this technology to assess movies, ads, classes, podcasts like this, video podcasts. And because we have 50,000 brains, we have good metrics. So it's structured very well. Even though there are low points in Hitman's Bodyguard, for long form content like movies and novels, there has to be variation in tension. So immersion, this neurologic state of social value, is metabolically costly to the brain. And so we know, you know, as a writer, David, I can't keep you at maximum suspense, tension, immersion. I'm happy with all those words for too long because it's just exhausting, right? So even, you know, I don't know, teenage-based slasher movies have some comic relief, have some reason to bring down the tension, let people have a little bit of a break. And so Hitman's Bodyguard does it very well. It has really high peak immersion moments. It ends on a peak immersion component. So we're really excited at the end emotionally, and we are invested in those characters. And so I think what's interesting is, again, I didn't work with those producers. They certainly didn't measure neurologic immersion in making the movie, but they intuitively understood their craft so well that in fact the brain valued this so much that, as you said, not only did that movie make a ton of money, but they made a sequel which made a ton of money.
Okay, so why don't we first define the term immersion?
So immersion is a neurologic state of attention and emotional resonance. So what does that mean? It means I'm here. Attention is kind of a 0-1 variable associated with the binding of dopamine in the frontal cortex. And this emotional resonance associated with the brain's release of oxytocin, a neurochemical that I've studied very extensively, that varies in the degree to which this experience gives me value emotionally, to the amount that I feel this thing is important to me. So for listeners, if you think about any highly emotional event in your life, birth of a child, wedding, 9/11, right? Those are seared in your memory. So highly emotional experiences are saved in a very particular way in the brain. We see the same thing with even short form content like ads or movies, where if they're highly immersive, then not only do we remember them and enjoy them, but it creates a desire to repeat that experience.
So you talked about a commercial, I think it was called The Empty Chair, and why that was. So why don't you tell us about the commercial and why was it so successful?
Thank you. So let me do a backup, which is when we started doing this. So all you science writers and scientists, you know that the most important personality trait is to be skeptical of everything. So we started doing this, and so we were tasked by the Department of Defense and some other agencies to find signals in the brain that in combination would accurately predict people's behavior, to improve communication, to reduce conflict, right? These are good reasons we have all this millions of dollars of taxpayer money. Thank you, taxpayers. You also help support this research. So I'm in the prediction business, not in the feeling business. And yet, interestingly, most of the variation in this neurologic state immersion is due to emotional states. But we started with, can we just predict what people do? Like, that's a hard thing to do across domains. And again, through almost 20 years of work, found this. So when we started doing this, we tried to predict as many things as possible. Super Bowl commercials. Can we predict YouTube views of these things? Yes, we can with high accuracy. And then I was contacted by this global ad agency, BBDO, that in a public forum claimed that their ads cause the brain to make oxytocin. Okay, well, I developed a protocol involving blood draws to measure that. I'm sure they didn't do blood draws. So I'm like, come on, BS. This is not true. So anyway, I found them. I wrote to them. I'm like, if you really want to measure this, actually, it's not just oxytocin. It's a larger neurologic state I call immersion. I'd be happy to test and see if your ads do, in fact, are immersive or not. And they said, okay. I'm putting words in their mouth, but this is the way it came off in the email or in the phone call. Okay, you nerdo scientists, you think you're so smart? Here's the game we're going to play. We're going to send you 18 of our ads, and so 6 different brands. So 3 for Bud Light, 3 for Guinness. So we're going to get to the empty chair ad. 3 for Visa, and our clients have ranked those ads for the sales bump they induced. So I never had sales bump data. I'm in the prediction business, but I never could predict sales because no one shares that data. And they said, go for it. You do your magic, whatever it is, and you tell us for each of these 6 brands, which is the best ad. And so one of those was empty chair. And I'll get to Guinness in a second, David. And I said, all right, I'm a skeptic. I'm a skeptic of my own work. Maybe I'm just lucky. Maybe I'm full of crap. Who knows? So let's do that. So we ran this analysis, and indeed, we could predict with 83% accuracy 5 of the 6 best ads blinded, which I think is a good, very good outcome. And later off, they told, so what did we not predict? We didn't predict Bud Light. And later off, they said, oh yeah, sales are affected by concert and swag giveaways at bars and all kinds of things. So they gave us a red herring, and our technology didn't even pick up the red herring. So we did pretty darn well. So one of the ads that they gave us to test was an ad they made for Guinness called Empty Chair, which has no words, has a little bit of music and ambient sound, and it is off the scale an amazing ad, which is really a very profound story. It's so profound you don't need words. So I think for us as writers, we think, okay, that's awful. or maybe it's great. I don't know, right? The visuals do that. So it's an ad where you see this woman who runs a neighborhood pub, and every day she turns on the sign for the pub and she puts a glass of Guinness at a table with a chair. And time goes on in this 60-second ad, and people come and go. And every day she puts that table and that sets out that beer on that table. And it's very subtle. You kind of see the Guinness logo, but they're not slamming you in the face with this. And then one of those speeded up times, someone goes to grab the chair, and she just very subtly kind of shakes her head just a little bit. So well done. You guys can find this on YouTube, Guinness empty chair. She shakes her head and the guy leaves the chair. So now we have a mystery, right? We have this woman. Who is she waiting for? Why is there a chair? Why does she pour a beer every night? Does she not know who's coming? I mean, what is this all about? So we're really sucked into this woman's life in a very short period of time. And now the perspective changes, and we see ourselves, we as the camera, walking towards the outside of the pub. And then the focus changes, and we see walking into the pub, the camera's now looking at the door, a soldier with a big rucksack. And he walks in what looks like his neighborhood pub. And he sees the chair with a glass of Guinness on the table. And he walks over, takes it up and drinks it, and sees the barmaid and just give her a subtle nod. So they know each other somehow. We don't know. And then other people in the bar see him and they raise their glasses and salute him. That's about a perfect story. I'm like tearing up just telling you I love the story so much, right? So we don't have to say anything, right? It's aspirational. We haven't resolved the conflict, which is, I think, one reason it works so well. What's the relationship between the woman and the man? They can't be husband and wife. He would have kissed her, right? Are they brother and sister? Just some dude in the neighborhood? We don't know that. But I think the point of that ad is that if we want to support these amazing human beings that keep us safe, that do a terribly hard job, perhaps next time you go to the pub, you might want to drink a Guinness, just maybe. So that ad did extremely well in market. And BBDO, to their great benefit, also, I mean, they were so honest with me. They made some pretty crummy ads for Guinness. I mean, crummy in the market and crummy from an immersion perspective. So, you know, that's a great story. And they chose not to have any words on that, which I think is also very interesting. They felt it was more powerful without having a written script. So I'm wondering, David, if how that resonates with you, to have a story without words.
Well, you know, it's, Ernest Hemingway wrote very short sentences. So,
True.
you know,
the famous 6-word story.
I think if you can tell a story, I mean, I think the key to, I mean, I would like to think that the words are important, which I think they are. And I think that even if you see something visually, you are telling yourself, well, why, you're thinking, oh, this makes me happy, but you're thinking, so you are saying words to yourself. So, yeah. I mean, if you just showed someone an empty book without context, it wouldn't mean much. Someone had to write this story.
Right.
And he decided, it's kind of like a silent movie. Silent movie can bring, can move people very much also. So before we go back into the world of advertising, which I think is very interesting, so, the full title of the book is Immersion, the Science of the Extraordinary and the Source of Happiness. So let's talk about what the science of the extraordinary is and what the source of and as relating to the source of happiness. And also, I guess, some people ask me, I was talking about this, and they say, well, is happiness just a chemical being? And I mean, if your brain just makes oxytocin, are you going to be happy? And I said, well, it's usually, involved, and it's usually involved about, an experience, like a mother holding a baby, a father holding a baby, or, something that makes you happy. So I don't think just injecting oxytocin to you in a room will just make you happy all of a sudden if you're blindfolded. But why don't you talk about, what does immersion have to do with the science of the extraordinary? You also talk about superfans and also the source of happiness. And also the other thing I want you to talk about and then for those in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them, is, attachment. Like some people, in New York, some people that they identify more with a baseball team than they do with their families. They're thrilled that they won the series and stuff. And you also said some people are very attached to their cell phones. They can't imagine living without their cell phone.
Yeah.
More than living with their spouse. So can we talk a little bit about what is happiness have to do with all this?
Yeah. So let's start with extraordinary. So from the individual's perspective, I don't know anyone who wants to go into the DMV, right? It's just it's awful. I live outside Los Angeles. 80% of Hollywood movies have lost money the last 30 years. How's that even possible? How have we not learned anything? I understand Hollywood accounting and the movie making is complicated, but book writing, man, it's hard to make money on books now. Remember the old days you used to get advances? My first book, I got a really nice fat advance. That was exciting. Nowadays, good luck, right? Unless you have 5 million Twitter followers or something. So why are we getting less of the extraordinary? And I think, first of all, it's so much easier to create content of all types. It's, it's super easy. And so you get a lot more content. So you just have a bigger distribution, and some of that's going to be fabulous, something on Netflix or HBO, and some of it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be pretty terrible, YouTube, homemade stuff. But some of the YouTube stuff's wonderful, actually. Having found this weird neurologic state that seems to capture the value we get from experiences means that we can go backwards. We can reverse engineer experiences and measure and improve them. So my favorite business book is by Pine and Gilmore, The Experience Economy. And they talk about how to stage business experiences, customer experiences, just like you're staging a play. You rehearse, you practice, you get feedback, so that every time you open your clothing store on Fifth Avenue, it's an amazing experience for those customers. What's missing from that, and Joe Pine's a friend of mine, is measurement, right? So now again, I can rehearse and try and get some feedback, but if I can actually measure second by second, I can make that experience extraordinary. That's what customers want. And actually, that's what the stores want, right? So the term of art in business is customer lifetime value. That experience is extraordinary. Neurologically, I want to do it again because it's so rare. And so that increases my customer lifetime value. So yes, I think we all live in the experience economy. We want to have great experiences. And that's a hell of a long subtitle. So let me finish it. So having measured 50,000 brains, those different chapters of the book say, here's what we've learned about making great corporate training and education. Here's what we learned about entertainment. Here's what we learned about advertising. Here's what we learned about meetings, that you can use these insights that seem to be general rules about creating at least better experiences, if not extraordinary ones. And then the very end of the book is about happiness. And there's some really interesting emerging evidence, a little from my lab and some other labs, that when we have these peak immersion experiences, when we have extraordinary experiences, we begin to train our brains to be fully present, to be emotionally engaged deeply in the experiences we're having. And that can increase our happiness, allow us to live more satisfied lives, and in some evidence, longer and healthier lives, because it trains us to connect. So much of our life satisfaction comes from our relationships, right? We're social creatures. We need other humans around us. And so if I'm deeply committed to my wife or my friends, if I try to think about making every minute with them extraordinary, then they just love me more. They want to spend more time with me. And then I get that extra love back. And now we're in this great a virtuous cycle in which we have this deep, abiding sense of connection. And as viewers probably know, having strong social connections is more important to extending your life than quitting smoking. So for the smokers out there, just have a lot of friends, good friends, and quit smoking. So that's a big leap, right, David? And so there's, I think in the book, I try to do a careful mapping from, yes, we all want extraordinary experiences. They do impact the brain. They create this desire to repeat them, but they can train us to be better. So here's an easy example. There's a couple little sections of the books about pets. We've done some research, published research on animal-human relationships. So if you have a dog at home, sometimes a cat, but dogs are better, like mine sitting at my feet here, right? They give us so much love. I think of dogs as the best example of humans playing God. Like if I wanted to make a creature to be my friend, what would it be like? Well, it's going to be like always happy to see me, ready to go anytime I want to do something, protecting, you will protect me, right? It'll bark at least. So there's a very strong relationship between our immersion in dogs and their immersion in us. So this is not in the book, but I've actually created wearables for my dog, and I can measure its immersion when I'm playing with them. And this dog's over the moon crazy about me. And I'm sure your dogs are over the moon crazy about you too. And guess what? I get that feedback, and I feel, I say I love my dog. Like, the worst about dogs is having to put them down when they get really old. So I hope maybe my dog will outlive me. But it's that kind of feedback. And when you have very close friends, I think, David, how nice it is, particularly as you get older. Don't you love it when you have a friend that you've known for 30 or 40 years and they call you up, talk to you, and they go, I love you, David. Oh, you feel so good. Like, yeah, I've known this person 40 years. They love me. They really love me after all. They know all about my faults. They know all the stupid things I've done, and they still love me. Like, oh man, you just made my day. So anyway, I'm so happy when that happens. And my claim is that immersion can train us to be so fully emotionally connected to social experiences that we get better at our relationships.
So I have a question, which is not really, you don't talk about in your book, but it's friendships. And because, you just sort of reminded me. So I have a big college reunion coming up. And when I speak to people who I went to college with, I feel like I can pick up I can not speak to them for 10 years, and immediately I speak to them. And because we shared common experiences, common music, common heartbreaks, common war protests, things like that. And the friends you meet now are, it's different. And I've heard that the same thing. People who've been in the Army, they say it's the greatest time in their lives. These people made the most of them, even though there was terrible experiences, obviously. And so why are friendships that are forged when we're, teenagers and young adults so strong in our brains compared to, the friendships we meet now?
My friend David, I'm going to give you an A+ for that question.
Okay, thank you.
It is such a good question.
Okay.
So it turns out that when we look at the underlying neurochemical, neuroelectrical basis for this powerful connection I'm calling immersion, right? So immersion could be between people, as you said, phones, we anthropomorphize almost everything. That a moderate level of stress facilitates greater attachment, greater immersion. So you're thrown into college, you're in some foreign city, you don't know anybody, you got to figure this out. Classes are hard, way harder than high school, right? All this stuff's happening to you, and you're stuck in a dorm with a bunch of people that you got to figure out how to get along with. So that level of stress, just like being in combat for the military, in surveys of soldiers who've been in combat, they say, who do you feel closest to? Number one are their children. Number two are the people they served with. Number three is the spouse, right? Because the spouse generally hasn't been in combat. They don't understand that. So even your spouse, David, unless you met your spouse in college, your spouse doesn't know what happened to you in college, right? But your friends do. All this crazy stuff, this great growth, both the stress, but also the time. And so I think one takeaway for listeners is an investment in relationships is an investment of time. So let me make it more concrete. I'm a big introvert and I love my job. I can sit in my lab by myself for 12 hours a day and be totally happy. But when I started doing this work 15, 20 years ago, I realized the neurologic value of experiences, and I started investing time and effort and emotional effort into relationships. And I turned 50, 7, 8 years ago, and I had 4 surprise birthday parties. 4. Never had that as a kid, right? It's not because I'm so wonderful. It's because I invested in relationships, and I had people who really cared about me and wanted to make that milestone birthday special. So, I think, again, for listeners, it's time and quality of the relationship, right? So if I talk in the book a bit about the sources of really life satisfaction and thriving, and you found people who are unhappy, who are neurotic, your happiness goes down because as a social creature, you start absorbing some of that kind of negative energy. But you've got people who really care about you, who are invested in you, who again love you for who you are, all your warts, all your wonderful parts, and all your failures. Man, you just need a couple of those in your life, and you're in good shape. Really. Did I answer your question, David, or did I sidestep it?
You did, yeah. For the audience, if you have questions, I made a mistake, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them. There were one or two questions that came in before, that people did when they registered. One is your theory related to the concept of flow? So first of all, tell us what the flow is, and then whether you think. Okay.
Right. So I'm going to change the premise of the question. So no theory. This is really about measurement, right? So this is extrapolating from measurement. So I don't think there's much of a theory in here. It's just deriving implications from measurement. Right. So flow was a term invented by my recently deceased and dear colleague, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was a professor of psychology and one of the founders of this field of positive psychology. These factors that create meaning in our life, make us happy and satisfied, and help us flourish. So flow is a psychological state that is measured. I'm a measurement guy, measured by self-report. That's associated with being actively engaged in experience. Like writing is a great example of flow. When you write, you lose track of time, and you go back and look at what you've written. You go, "Holy crap! Who wrote this thing? This is good!" Right? So I think all of us have had that experience. Or anything you create where you're just lost in it. So conversely, immersion is a high frequency set of electrical signals from the brain that are associated with an active or passive task. So in the concept of flow, I can't be in flow when I watch a movie passively, but I can be immersed in a movie. I know that because David and I are terrible movie criers, and we see a sad movie, we cry all the time. So that's a transportation into that other world, right? So I can be passively involved in some activity, but there are some overlaps. In immersive experiences, people tend to lose track of time. They find those experiences, they report them to be unexpectedly enjoyable. Like, I didn't know this was going to be so great. I'm really surprised. They want to repeat it. So flow states are something that people tend to want to repeat. So the short answer is, great question. My colleague invented this term flow. I have to do something different, and I'm a neuro guy and he's a psych guy. So, but yeah, I think they're closely related. So thank you for that great question.
Okay, this is the question. Does the book touch on the topic and potential role of the imagination?
That's such a good question. What a totally educated audience. It does not at all. But now that you've said that, I would love to measure immersion while people imagine themselves doing something. So experimentally, that has poor experimental control, because if you tell me you're imagining walking on the beach with your loved one, I don't really know if you are or not. If I have you walk on the beach with your loved one and measure that, but I do think that there are imaginative states that are highly immersive. I just don't have a good way to measure them, but maybe if I thought harder about it, I would. So thank you for that great research idea.
Okay. So some of your work has been funded by the U.S. Department of Defense and other government agencies to identify signals in the brain that could predict what people would do after a message or an experience. What was their motivation for this?
It really was, I think, twofold. One is to communicate more effectively. So there's a law in the U.S., federal law, that prohibits the U.S. military from messaging U.S. citizens. So this research was funded to help soldiers more effectively communicate to foreign populations. So that could be to our collaborators, could be to try to convince enemies to lay down arms. And so the idea was really to reduce conflict. And so we know that if we can effectively communicate, gosh, with our loved ones, with our neighbors, you can do that well, you can reduce conflict. So the idea was, rather than going into some Afghan village where the Taliban are hiding out and asking the elder with a gun to his head, where are those bad guys? You could tell a story. And that story could be, hey, you have children, I have children. I want to go back home safe to my kids. You want to keep your kids safe. If you can tell me where these bad people are, we can remove them from your village. We'll never come back. Right. So that's really different. So we ended up building or providing the research in which they built some software to train soldiers to communicate more effectively, which I think is a noble task. So was happy to spend a lot of time on that. But this, as you mentioned, David, that communication is not in a vacuum. It is generally in a very stressful environment. And so how to communicate when kind of stress is high, emotions are high, is also complicated, right? I can't be too over engaging. I have to be calm as a storyteller or a communicator. So there's a chapter in the book, I think the second last chapter is on persuasion, right? Should we actually persuade people? What's the ethics of that? And so when we were getting this government funding, which ended some years ago, every 6 months we had an in-person meeting, and we were required as part of the meeting to have a session with an ethicist. And we discussed with these government contractors, with me, with this ethicist, whether we were going too far, right? Should we create tools that allow people to more effectively persuade each other? And persuasion is what social creatures do. I've been married 27 years. I'm still trying to persuade my wife to be nice to me and hopefully not leave me. I still got to be nice to her. I can't be a total jerk, right?
No.
So that's what we do. So I'm okay with, you could say influence, but it's really persuasion in my view. So anyway, for the software company I built around this technology to democratize the ability to measure immersion, we do have a no-fly list. So we don't work with politicians, for example, or political campaigns. We do very little work with the government now. I think there are cases where we don't, unless everyone has these tools, kind of like nuclear weapons. If everyone has them, then we have a balance of power. But if only a couple people have them, then it potentially could be dangerous, right? So I do think a lot about the ethics. And so the ethics are discussed in the book. I'm sorry, that was a super long answer for a short but important question.
Okay. Another question from an audience member. What is the neuroendocrine profile of an intense immersion experience? And do those with stronger social relationships have higher oxytocin levels?
Ooh, good answer. Good question. Let's see if I can give it a good answer. So the core components of immersion are dopamine, this neurochemical associated with arousal, with attention, particularly dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. So this is the drugs for like ADD, like Adderall, increase dopamine binding to the prefrontal cortex. That's why they increase attention. And oxytocin. So oxytocin is associated with this kind of empathy, emotional connection, attachment. Those are all very similar things. So that's a very weird state because one is a kind of an arousal response and one's a calming response. Oxytocin's calming. And so it's really a switching between those two. And that's why I gave it a special name. So I really like the second part of your question. So I'm going to rephrase that as, are there individuals who are kind of immersion super responders? And the answer is yes. So we have found that individuals who by personality are more agreeable and more empathic, for the same experience will have a much bigger immersion response. So these are the very warm people. They're people. They love social experiences. They're neither extroverts or introverts, by the way. We find no difference for that, which is kind of surprising. But it's people who they're just super warm. So they tend to have more friends. They tend to be happier. They just always have people around them, which I think is amazing. So yeah, so that's mostly genetic, right? So now, having said that, again, like for me, I'm trying to train myself to be warmer and sweeter and more loving and more empathic. And I think I've done that a little bit. But we all can get better, at least some sense.
I remember
So, yes,
the New York Academy of Sciences says that I had to train myself to hug people because I'm not a natural hugger. Right. Yeah.
It's so true.
Yeah.
But then once you get used to it, you just keep doing it.
Yeah. Here's another question. Can you talk about turning the ordinary to extraordinary? Can you talk about turning the ordinary to extraordinary during periods of chosen solitude? And I think that's pretty germane, and then there was also forced solitude because of COVID. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Those are two parts of a really good question. So immersion really is an experience with some kind of social content. So we did do a bunch of research, all of it unpublished because it failed, on creating experiences with awe. We did everything from high-res videos of sunrises. It's hard to put people on top of a mountaintop and watch the sunrise, but I discovered that James Earl Jones narrated the entire Bible. So we took like Psalm 23, like really powerful Bible verses with, and the problem was that he did this really fast. And so it sounded like Darth Vader, reading the Bible. What is brooding? And like, oh, that didn't work. And I think for non-religious, younger people tend to be not to be religious. If you're not religious, the Bible's not going to work for you. So we tried a ton of stuff. We tried putting people in isolation helmets, so people will hallucinate pretty quickly if you give them no feedback. Didn't really work. I do talk in the book about going with my daughter to an experience in Santa Monica called Dining in the Dark, where literally there's not a speck of light. It's meant to really enhance your experience of that food. All the waiters are sight impaired. You have to put your hand on people's shoulders to walk to the table. You can't see a darn thing. And it's a really interesting experience. It was not that more immersive. We compared it to just like going out regularly. It wasn't that more immersive. Was more, but not a ton more. So I do think it's important to have solitude. It's important to not have these stupid devices sending us info all the time. One adjunct to that is that this medium that we're on, this 2D medium, is actually not so bad for immersion. So compared to in-person interactions, this kind of video conferencing gives us between 50 and 80% of the immersion of an in-person interaction. So 50 to 80, it depends on how much we're interacting. I'm talking way too much to make this a great conversation for poor David, but we should let him talk some more. But anyway, so there's solitude and then there's solitude. So yeah, in COVID, I think there was a real kind of depression. Can I just say one more thing, David? I'm sorry, very long answer. Sure. I apologize. We also developed this physiologic measure we call psychological safety, which is our comfort to be around other people. And we did see that, as social creatures, we do want to congregate generally. Even introverts like me want to congregate. We did see a real decline in psychological safety and things like team meetings, where people who were remote working had much less psychological safety. They just felt isolated. So it's probably not good to have too much solitude, even if it was enforced. It was sort of nice in the beginning, right? Particularly for introverts. Wasn't that lockdown in the beginning kind of pleasant? Like, oh my gosh, I don't have to go anywhere. Don't have to wear pants. I don't have to talk to anybody. But then after a while, you need to come back and socialize.
And again, Shakespeare wrote 3 plays during a lockdown of Black Plague, including King Lear. So,
there you go.
There is something to be said for that. I also found, in terms of being immersive experiences, like when you're watching a movie by yourself and you get really engrossed in it, I don't know if it helps to have another person there. Does that make it a better experience, or it doesn't matter?
It does. So we've actually done those experiments. So immersion for like entertainment content is actually higher almost always when you have people around you. So one piece of evidence for that is when you watch a comedy in a movie theater, you get much more laughter. Where when you're at home, sometimes you kind of guffaw a little bit, but you don't really belly laugh quite so much for some reason. So there's this sort of social, ability, motivation to kind of share your emotions.
I had the opportunity to see Larry David and the cast of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and they showed they showed their new episode that was going to be, and it was great to be in a complete audience of like 300 people at the 92nd Street Y, who were all enjoying it and laughing at the same time, rather than just laughing at home. That was a lot of fun.
And to see those actors live, right? It's amazing. What an amazing experience.
So here's another question. What is the best way to teach children how to live in a way that will give them more positive, immersive experiences throughout their lives? So can immersion be taught?
Yeah, beautiful question. You can teach even an old dog a new trick. So for young dogs, young kids, definitely. I think part of that gets almost like this solitude question. Um, like most parents, I limit how much screen time my kids had when they were young. I think it's really being present. Someone whose name I forgot, famous, said that the key with children is to listen with your eyes, right? So I want to be fully present for them so they can be fully present for me. And so I think you're training them that they are the most important thing in the world to you. And even to our friends, right? Really being fully there. My wife, I have a daughter who's 19 now, but my wife said, how can you have a 3-hour talk with your daughter? Like, you don't talk to me for 3 hours. And I said, we're both introverts. And I said, we make a lot of space for each other. We can talk for 3 hours because there'll be periods of silence. We don't need to fill it where the other person is thinking about a response or thinking about some kind of evidence for something that we're talking about. It is kind of an amazing thing to have a 3-hour conversation with somebody. But also, what a gift. And I told my daughter that, like, oh my gosh, I don't talk to anybody for 3 hours. And I find you really fascinating as a human. And probably that's just nature, making me think that my own children are the most fascinating people in the world. So there are some movements you may have heard about, like electronic Sabbath. So 1 day a week, no electronics, no screens for parents or children. Even things like the timeout. So neurologically, when I began to think about that, so if a child who's having a bad time, and so I'm going to isolate that person to make them feel more stressed. So for my children, I created the time in. You're having a bad time. You need to sit in my lap for as many minutes as you are old. I'm just going to hold you. It works beautifully, right? That's what social creatures do. And the nice thing about that, by the way, is once they got to be like teenagers and they still sometimes freak out, I'm like, okay, you need to time in. They're like, oh my God, don't do it when my friends are over. Like, we'll go in my room and do it, but you're 12 or 13 years old, you still gotta sit in my lap for 12 minutes. You don't have to say anything. You gotta sit here. I'm just gonna hold you.
The actor Larry Hagman, dating myself, he was in Dallas and I Jimmy Genie. He never said a word on Sundays. He just said, I don't talk on Sundays.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
He talks the whole week, right? That's his job.
Yeah.
Oh, I would try that. That's great, David. I'll give that a shot. I don't talk much anyway. So if I talk zero, and no one would notice probably.
Okay. Another question. It seems like women more than men would more naturally be inclined to have an immersive experience. True or false?
Partially true. So of these two personality traits, agreeableness and empathy, in the samples we've gotten, this is thousands of people, about 60 to 65% of those are women and about a third to 40% are men. So women have a tend to be more immersed in experiences. And I think, again, biologically, evolutionarily, evolved for more caretaking than men are. Again, lots of variation here. So again, interestingly for men, one of the inhibitors of immersion is testosterone. So David, when you and I were 15, 16-year-olds, were we, engaged with other people unless we thought some girl would, I don't know, make out with us? Not really, right? So, I think as we think about creating environments for our children, for ourselves, high stress, high testosterone, those are not conducive to immersion, which I think is kind of interesting. And so again, women don't have that. And estrogen has an impact as well. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll leave it go.
When you're doing your research and coming up with the questions, what are the results that are really surprise you sometimes?
That's a great question. First of all, the best thing about doing research is being surprised. Right? If I have a hypothesis, run an experiment, and I confirm my hypothesis, I haven't learned much. Right? Maybe I've learned, I'm a mechanism guy, so I'm looking at neurologic mechanisms. Maybe I've learned about mechanisms, but behaviorally I haven't learned much. So my hope always is to be wrong, to be surprised, nature is much more complicated than the usually simple or even simplistic hypotheses we have. And that's beautiful. That means you have to dig into nature and try to figure out what it's telling you. I tell the students, you have to live with the data. You have to let it talk to you, whisper to you, sleep with it on your pillow at night. It'll tell you, nature will tell you, what's really happening. I think one of the most interesting things we've done, which is discussed just a little in the book, at the end of the book, is the ability to actually change pretty concrete preferences. So we've done just a little bit of work on changing people's political preferences. In this case, not with measuring immersion, but actually using drugs that promote or inhibit immersion. And so we've actually shown that we can, at least in the short term, let's say while you're on a drug, influence only one group of individuals in 2 studies, and that is weakly affiliated Democrats. So if you're a strong Democrat, these drugs that affect immersion, synthetic oxytocin, synthetic testosterone, no effect. For all Republicans, it can't affect you. So again, you can make a generous or ungenerous interpretation of that. But weakly affiliated Democrats, so they're kind of like, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not hardcore. I'm kind of in the center. We give them oxytocin. They like Republicans a lot more. We give them testosterone. They really like Republicans more. And so the oxytocin paper is published. The testosterone one is currently in a review at a journal. But large samples that we ran during presidential elections when politics was salient. So, it looks like there's a big genetic component to political preferences, but that I can change it neurochemically, at least acutely, is kind of interesting. A little tidbit from that testosterone study is that there was no difference in baseline testosterone among any of those 4 groups, strong or weak Democrats, strong or weak Republicans, except weak Republicans had the highest testosterone. Weak Democrats had the highest testosterone, higher than Republicans, and that's kind of counter to Republicans being about defense or something. So I think people are complicated, and I think we don't know. Well, our brains live in this soup of 200 neurochemicals, and they're just sloshing around, affecting us in ways we don't even understand. So in these studies, when we administer blinded neuroactive drugs, again, with permission, with a medical screening, it's all safe. We are able to influence things that you don't think you could change that much. So we're very adaptive creatures.
Yeah. So you talk about. I said we're going to talk about commercials a little bit, and you have your key takeaways at the end of this chapter. Said advertisers have 15 seconds to capture attention. They must provoke an emotional response. Stories drive emotional attachment to products. Extend peak emotional moments to improve branding recall. Create peak immersion at the end of messages to generate the biggest impact. Effective commercials have product story congruence. So I mean, the empty chair one is a story that, the ending was the strongest part of it.
Right. So again, there's a strong positive correlation between immersion and recall weeks later of the details of an experience. And so if I'm ending on that high note, that high immersion point, like empty chair, and that's when the branding occurs, then I'm associated emotionally that experience, this beautiful little film, with Guinness beer, right? So oftentimes we see in commercials a kind of nice story arc where there's a nice peak and then that story resolves and then the branding happens at the end. Now I've reduced tension, right? So think of immersion as tension, like story tension. I've reduced the emotional tension of that. So either do the branding at that peak in the middle of the commercial, you don't have to wait till the end, particularly on like YouTube when people are clicking away fast, or have several branding moments, or structure this that you've got this peak emotional moment at the end. You don't have to resolve that story necessarily in an ad. So we've done a ton of work with movie studios and movie trailers. So listeners may know that the distributors of movies make the most money the first 2 weeks. Then they have a declining share of the theater revenue. So they really need to get butts in chairs the first couple of weeks. So I spent a lot of time and money developing these movie trailers. And so worked with a bunch of the studios in Hollywood on this. And if you look at a movie trailer, you can find one online. Not now, you got to listen to me for a couple more minutes later. You'll see that they're almost always half of a narrative arc. I introduce characters, I have a mystery, I have a crisis. That crisis reaches a peak, and then you got to buy a ticket to find out what happens. So I think ads could follow that same kind of thing, right? Often in the ad, we want the product or service to resolve the problem. but there can be a implied resolution of that problem, right? And I talked about you started, David, with the Hitman's Bodyguard movie. And in that, there were 3 storylines. And one of those is a hitman's crazy in love with his wife, Salma Hayek, wants to get back to her. But that storyline's never resolved. He survives some of the hitman trying to kill him. There's 2 hitmen, but anyway, the bad hitman's trying to kill the goodish hitman. Anyway, Samuel Jackson. And then, we understand as viewers that, okay, he survived, he got through this gauntlet, and so he will return to his wife. So that doesn't have to be explicitly resolved. So I think from an advertising perspective, you don't have to resolve that storyline. And you have to open hot. There's some evidence I cite in the book that, attention spans, even for us older adults, has gotten shorter and shorter. We've been trained to get the immediate gratification. So just like a James Bond movie, open hot, right? Give me a reason to get involved in this thing, and then show me some humans with real emotion, with a crisis, and then you can get me to care about this.
So the last question is, what emotion is the enemy of immersion?
That's such a deep question. So a couple. One is fear. So very high levels of stress. So epinephrine is the neurochemical, really inhibits this emotional response. So if I'm in super fear mode, I'm in survival mode. I am not worried about looking out for you. Unless you can help me get out of this. This is I'm just trying to get the hell out of here. So that's not good. And the other is, as I mentioned earlier, testosterone. Right? If I'm all about competition and dominance, I'm not about connection and emotion and sharing and opening up. And that's why I think it's wonderful that nature has given us this decline in testosterone as men age, a further decline in testosterone when you have children and when you're in a committed relationship. And only from my own experience, when you have girl children, you pick out little frilly dresses every day, your testosterone goes to 0, you can be a big girly man. On the other hand, my kids love me like crazy, so that's okay.
Okay. Could you show, do you have a copy of your book that you can show?
I sure do.
Because mine's on my Kindle, so it's not as interesting.
There's the book.
Okay, and where can people get this book?
Easiest place to go to Amazon. Get it Kindle, you can get a hard copy, you can get a soft copy. And in November, we'll have the Audible version coming out as well.
Okay. So next week, a week from today, I'll be speaking to Dr. Bryn Nelson about his new book called Flushed: The Remarkable Science of an Unlikely Treasure. And it's a exploration of the teeming microbiome of possibility in human feces from a microbiologist and a science journalist. In November, I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Sam Parnia, who's at NYU, who studies people who have died. Well, their heart stopped and they've died and come back. And he's found that the experiences of people all over the world is very similar. They report seeing similar things and similar feelings. And I won't talk about it more than that, but he's measuring brain activity goes on even when our heart stops. And for the people who come back, they tell very similar stories. So he's going to talk about that. So Paul, you might want to tune in on that. I'm sure you're interested as a neuroscientist. Anyway, my guest tonight was Dr. Paul Zak. And I see there are two. Do you have time for any more questions? Or
yeah, hit me. We got 5 minutes. Let's go for it.
Okay. No, it's not a question. What is? Thank you, David, and thank you, Paul. So that's it. So
and reach out if you've got questions. You can just Google me and you'll find me online. So happy to interact with anybody. But thank you for this great honor, David. It was a pleasure.
It's great to see you again. And two books later. And we'll speak to you soon. And everyone out there, please be safe. New variants are out there, as everyone knows. And we'll talk about that at some point, probably with Dr. Moore. And anyway, thank you again for Dr. Zak for spending time with us. He's in California, so it's a different time zone. And everyone out there, be safe, and hopefully we'll see you in the next couple of weeks. Take care. Good night.